Strong thermal emission enhancement. Wait, what was that? Strong thermal emission velocity enhancement. Yeah.
I always refer to it as he, and I don't know why that started, but I had heard people kind of talk about him like that, and so when I saw him for the first time, I was like, okay, that's Steve.
We do have Steve. Steve is awesome. Steve's a really good guy. Like when Steve comes out, it's a good night.
Steve is a celebrity in the aurora chasing world, and more specifically in Alberta. Why Alberta? Because Steve was actually named and discovered by some of the original Alberta Aurora Chasers group members. And one of those group members happened to be Chris.
So Steve, who is Steve, is a very interesting way to phrase the question. Steve is, in a lot of ways, a persona in the Aurora community. Steve is an enigma. Steve is, I've described Steve as Aurora's brother or cousin, and where did the name come from? That's always an interesting story. The Steve story started out in 2015. We were talking in the community about this phenomena that we saw in the sky that we saw with Aurora at the same time as Aurora sometimes. But it wasn't something that many of us had seen before. I started seeing it in 2014. Others had seen it long before that. But it was this weird thing that you would see sometimes with Aurora, not always. It was also in a place in the sky where you wouldn't always be looking. Aurora would be over here and kind of dying down, and Steve would be straight overhead, and you wouldn't always look there. And it's not always noticeable to the naked eye very, very prominently. A lot of times it just looks like an airplane contrail to the naked eye. Sometimes it is quite bright, but a lot of the time it's fairly dim. The first time I saw it, that's what I thought. I thought it was an airplane contrail, but it was a little bit odd. So I pointed my camera at it and took a long exposure photo of it. And through that photo, I could see that it was emitting light. It was giving off light. It wasn't reflecting light in the same way that a contrail would. So clearly that was something different. I had asked around in the Alberta Aurora Chasers community, but in some of the other Aurora communities, if anybody had seen this before or what it was. The answer that I had got back from some of the other communities was that this was what they were calling proton arc. So we started calling it a proton arc as well. Made sense. Other people were calling it that, and that sort of was that was part of the story, or part of what we understood, until we came across a couple of scientists in late 2015, early 2016. Eric Donovan and Liz McDonald. Eric Donovan from the University of Calgary, Liz McDonald from NASA, and through those conversations we learned that this was not a proton arc. We learned that proton arcs are very different. Proton arcs are kind of fuzzy and green, maybe not even visible to the naked eye, as opposed to Steve, which is very narrow and mauve and very distinct. An idea started to form to research this from the scientists. But they wanted a placeholder name for it until such time as they figured out what the physical properties were of it. So they suggested that, because our community was bringing this to them, they suggested that we give it a temporary name, a placeholder name, and that was my homework. That was a task that I had given, that had landed on my plate. We were at a pub one evening and we were talking about this. So I mulled it over and I was thinking, how do you give a temporary name to somebody? So I decided I would bring it back to the community and get the community to discuss it. So I said, hey, there's this thing that we've been looking at. We thought it was called a proton arc. Eric and Liz have brought it to our attention that that's not the case, that we need to give it a temporary another name. to start the conversation, I propose that we call it Steve. Really meant as a conversation prompt, a ridiculous suggestion that others would take and say, no, let's give it something really profound and meaningful. That's not the way the conversation worked. Several ideas were proposed, and it wasn't like at any one point that we voted or said this shall be it going forth, but that's how the conversation evolved. And future observations, people were saying, hey, I saw Steve tonight, and here's another photo of Steve. And it just sort of stuck. And then the story went viral in 2017, I guess. Yeah, I'm fumbling with dates right now, but the story went viral when Eric presented his findings at the European Space Agency, and the name kind of got solidified at that point. When Eric presented his findings to the European Space Agency, titled "How I Met Steve," that's when the story went viral internationally. And then we presented the paper a year later, the citizen science paper a year later, and the scientists had proposed a backronym for the name, and they backronymed it to Strong Thermal Emission Velocity Enhancement, basically describing the physical features that they had observed with Steve at that time.
After further research on Steve, I learned that Elizabeth McDonald had a huge role on this subject. Elizabeth McDonald is a NASA scientist, and she just happened to be visiting Calgary at the time that I reached out to her. Unfortunately, we couldn't film an on-camera interview because of logistics and scheduling, but I was happy to sit down with her in a very noisy location and record what she had to say about Steve.
The result in the paper was not just what we found was that Steve was an optical signature of something that satellites had measured as a really strong flow from east to west, which is a peak in velocity, for 40 years. Satellites had measured something called a sub-auroral ion drift, and it's just like this little blip that the satellite will see once in a while. There's statistics on them of how often they're seen and what latitudes they're seen and all this stuff. So the sub-auroral ion drift has been studied for a long time, although it's not fully understood how it forms.
I've only seen Steve once, actually, but actually, technically I saw it twice. The first time Steve was a bit shorter, not like a full rainbow in the sky, and I didn't realize that's what it was. It was partially blocked, but yeah, I saw Steve once, and it was actually just from my backyard. It was that bright and visible and across the whole sky. And it was pretty cool. I don't know the specific person that did, but I do believe it was aurora chasers in Alberta that first discovered it, and I don't know if they submitted it for science, but I believe it was discovered here in Alberta.
Admin of Alberta Aurora Chasers group on Facebook, he used the word Steve from an animated film back in 2006, where I think it was a hedgehog that appears randomly and they called it Steve.
Steve was named by the group in 2016, something like that. Stands for Strong Thermal Emission Velocity Enhancement.
My inspiration for suggesting Steve came from Over the Hedge. And in Over the Hedge, they kind of basically do the exact same thing. In the movie, the animals, they come across this big thing that they don't know what it is. It intimidates them. They're very curious about it. And the squirrel, the very hyperactive squirrel, suggests, let's call it Steve. And at that point, everybody was very happy with that. All the other critters were very happy with that suggestion, and it gave them something to focus on, and it gave them something to understand what they were looking at. Steve is that extra thing on top of Aurora. We all understand Aurora. Well, we're all familiar with what we believe Aurora to be, and Steve is that little bit of rareness. It's like if you were to compare it to to birding. Steve is that rare bird that you can see sometimes. If you're lucky, if you know when and where to look, you might be able to catch it. So it's kind of like the icing on the cake, that little bit of extra bonus prize when you're out seeing aurora, to be able to say, oh, I saw that other thing that we've heard about, and I caught Steve. There's also that sense of persona that it has when it's got the name. You're actually kind of catching it. The Steve, the Steves in the group are always having fun too. They'll chime in and say, "What? No, I wasn't there."
To help tell the story of Steve and why people feel so compelled to document and capture it, I decided to reach out to some fellow photographers who I know have had an experience with Steve and asked if they would be okay with telling their story, not only about capturing Steve, but also about why they want to capture the Northern Lights in general.
We do have Steve. Steve's awesome. Steve's a really good guy. Like when Steve comes out, it's a good night. So
We've seen Steve, and Steve is this like overarching band of color. It's like intertwined pink, green, reds. So I believe the scientific term for Steve is strong thermal emission velocity enhancement.
Yeah, I don't know what Steve is. Steve's just a great guy, and when he comes out from an aurora chase, it's an amazing night. Steve's great because we have I have a shot of Steve over
Steve's great.
Steve's great. I have a shot of Steve over Rundle, and you have a great shot of Steve over Cascade. I love that shot of yours. It's incredible. And so it's like this other rare occurrence that's a really unique thing to capture. That's pretty amazing.
Albertans love Steve.
Albertans love Steve, yeah.
Steve, they call cousin of auroras. It's not basically the same phenomenon, and I'm not the right person to elaborate more on that. And it was this phenomenon that just appeared randomly, because northern lights are usually visible towards the north, and this is like going east to west. So you can see distinctly from the northern lights. And the color is different as well, and the structure is different too, like it moves differently. Aurora is excitement of electrons of the gases, like hitting the radiation and interacting with the atmosphere, whereas the Steve is like a hot moving gas. And I think the full name of this acronym Steve is Strong Thermal Emission Enhancement. Wait, what was that? Strong Thermal Emission Velocity Enhancement. Yeah.
I always refer to it as he, and I don't know why that started, but I had heard people kind of talk about him like that, and so when I saw him for the first time, I was like, okay, that's Steve, and it's kind of almost like this personality that people built. And I think the thing that fascinates me the most is that when I first saw it, I knew not a lot about it. I knew that the name originated from the group, but I think the concept with Steve that just fascinates me the most is that it is so non-understood at this point. Like, people are working on it obviously, but the fact that so many citizen scientists are actually involved in it, a lot of them from Alberta, I just found incredibly fascinating that we kind of found this phenomenon that we weren't even sure like what to think, and people just delved into trying to understand it. So I've been pretty fascinated with trying to understand it myself. In terms of citizen scientists, I've heard it quoted a couple times to do with Steve, just because I believe it came from people who don't necessarily have, I guess, an accreditation with science, like a degree behind them, or something saying they are Dr. So-and-so. People that were going out that were either to do with, photographers, or I don't actually know how to break that down. I'm thinking about that myself.
Citizen science is not just making a report on Facebook, because Facebook doesn't actually allow you to archive that data and access that data.
Right.
So Facebook is really great for the community aspects and the real-time conversation. But what we actually ask people to do with Aurorasaurus is to take an extra step and submit data via our platform, so that it can go into this global database and real-time map and feed the alerts that we put out as well. Chris and others would send us emails about, well, we have a few more observations. And in the Aurorasaurus project, we have monthly meetings with scientists and citizen scientists. And so we'd keep trying to encourage more observations, because the tendency is for something unusual that's reported to be like, oh, that's just a weird view of the usual aurora. But when it's all over Canada and you've gotten to know the people, you know them pretty well at this point, you trust them, you're like, no, that's not just, that really is a different thing.
Steve, you're going to catch me on the acronym here. Strong thermal emission velocity something.
Enhancement.
The enhancement, there's the last word, yeah. So basically it was, and I don't know the movie, but there was a character in the movie and it was a name for something that they, I don't know, didn't know or didn't understand or something for a while, and then the acronym, or I guess it's called a backronym, actually fit with the strong thermal emission velocity enhancement, if I got that right. I don't know what makes Steve such a celebrity, but I guess it's something different that I would say, again, like I said, you can see aurora fairly often, not the big storms, but you can see it fairly often, but if you went out and saw a mediocre aurora 20 times, you'd maybe only see Steve a couple times, I guess. Maybe that's why it's, like I said, I've only seen Steve properly once, and I've chased quite a bit over the last couple of years. Steve is apparently not an aurora, although I find it suspicious that it is always out during aurora. I would assume that the citizen science is pretty important. I guess it just allows more number of people out there submitting data and information that the scientists can use. I'm not much of a scientist at all. I understand the basics of aurora, and that's about it. And now I'm sitting here thinking maybe I should submit a little more to the Aurorasaurus logs. Yeah, so the night I saw Steve from my backyard, I think it was actually after a night of astrophotography. So it was the night after. And I knew there was a good chance for aurora that night, but I was just so exhausted. The data wasn't super strong, and I decided I wasn't going to go out that night, just mostly because I needed to recover. But of course, just as I was about to go to bed, I started getting some messages from some friends that I'd met through the community saying that Steve was out. So I got dressed as quickly as I could, got outside. Luckily, Steve was strong and full sky from east to west, just a rainbow across everywhere I could see. Luckily, Steve was strong and it was a big rainbow right across the sky, and I could see it right from my backyard. Got to share that moment with my wife too, which was fantastic because, like I said, I don't get to chase with her that much. So yeah, and I even grabbed a couple of photos. I was able to find just some evergreen trees out near my backyard, and because it was overhead, I shot up and framed it in the trees, and one of my favorite shots actually, just from my backyard.